Hi, everybody. It's March. Yay, we made it through December and January and February, and we have arrived at March. I know you all realize that spring break is in March, and it's a little too early for us to be doing things in the garden. We can still have plenty of snow in March, but it's not too early for us to start thinking and getting excited about spring on its way and the changes that it will bring for all of us. So I have a story that I found, and it is called The Curious Garden. This is actually inspired by a real place, and in the back there's an author's note about seeing a part of Manhattan, New York City area, where there was an abandoned, not used anymore part of the railway, and there were tracks there and benches and things, but nobody ever used that one anymore, so it just kind of sat neglected. Well, after a while, weeds and plants and grass started growing up around that and covering things up, and instead of just cement and steel, it was going back to nature. And so the author thought about maybe if this was an intentional project, see what a city like New York or other cities that are far from nature, if we could bring a little green and flowers and a little bit of joy to those who might be missing nature. So we have The Curious Garden. This is by Peter Brown. Let's see how this goes along. The illustrations are great. The Curious Garden. There once was a city without gardens or trees or greenery of any kind. Most people spent their time indoors, and as you can imagine, it was a very dreary place. However, there was one boy who loved being outside. Even on drizzly days, while everyone else stayed inside, you could always find Liam happily splashing through his neighborhood. It was one such morning that Liam made several surprising discoveries. He was wandering around the old railway, as he did from time to time, when he stumbled upon a dark stairwell leading up to the tracks. The railway had stopped working ages ago, and since Liam had always wanted to go explore the tracks, there was only one thing for the curious boy to do. Liam ran up the stairs, pushed open the door, and stepped out onto the railway. The first thing he saw was a lonely patch of color. Wildflowers and plants were the last thing he had expected to find up there, but when he took a closer look, it became clear that the plants were dying. They needed a gardener. Liam may not have been a gardener, but he knew that he could help. So he returned to the railway the very next day and got to work. The flowers nearly drowned, and he had a few pruning problems, but the plants patiently waited while Liam found better ways of gardening. As the weeks rolled by, Liam began to feel like a real gardener, and the plants began to feel like a real garden. Sometimes I think that's what anything takes, is you just to stick with it and maybe work out the kinks and figure out how to do things better. Most gardens stay in one place, but this was no ordinary garden. With miles of open railway ahead of it, the garden was growing restless. It wanted to explore. The tough little weeds and mosses were the first to move. They popped up farther and farther down the tracks and were closely followed by the more delicate plants. Over the next few months, Liam and the curious garden explored every corner of the railway. So try and think how it traveled. How did these wildflowers and the grasses, how did they move from where they were? Liam was watering and he was pruning. Do you think he was touching things and causing things to poof out a little bit of their pollen and maybe push out a few seeds that as birds and even he would walk by, they would go on his shoes or travel through the air? Look at this. Oh my goodness. That looks like a very fun place. Wonder if anybody else would even find it. A treasure up there, out of sight of most people. After spending his spring and summer and autumn with the garden, Liam's time on the railway was finally interrupted by winter. Heavy blankets of snow fell on the city that season, and for the first time since he'd become a gardener, Liam could not visit the plants. Rather than waste his winter worrying about the garden, Liam spent it preparing for spring. After 3 cold months, the snow finally began to melt, and Liam rolled his new gardening gear over to the railway. Winter had taken a toll on the garden, but thanks to Liam's planning, his handy new tools, and a little help from the sun, the plants soon awoke from their winter sleep. The garden had always wanted to explore the rest of the city, and that spring it was finally ready to make its move. Once again, the tough little weeds and mosses set out first. They popped up farther and farther from the railway and were closely followed by the more delicate plants. The garden was especially curious about old, forgotten things. Look at how it's taken over this old rusty car, kind of a shell of a car. And here's something boarded up. We have a tree growing out of there. Of course, in between cracks in the sidewalk. A few plants popped up where they didn't belong. Vines covering a stop sign, not very practical. On a fire hydrant. Others mysteriously popped up all at once. But the most surprising thing that popped up were the new gardeners. I love that. Look it carefully around and see if you can see anyone else who has taken a little patch and made it something that they're going to care for. Look at this. That would be a fun place to wander around. Many years later, the entire city had blossomed, but of all the new gardens, Liam's favorite was where it all began. Can you think back on the beginning where it was very dreary and dull and had nothing living around it? Look at what a little attention can do. Isn't that a wonderful transformation? This is the author's note about it. being inspired by something that they saw on a railway that was no longer used. So I think that is very important, actually. It's wonderful for our air, the carbon dioxide that uh, plants give off helps us clean our air, and we get oxygen from uh, the air, and uh, it just helps us. Oh, imagine the smell of some of these things. It just really does help us enjoy our environment and I think relax a little more. So look around you and see if there's a little spot of the earth that you could care for and transform it into something that is beautiful and green and can just really flourish if you give it a little bit of attention. I enjoyed this book. I hope you did too. And I will see you in the library real soon. Bye bye.